Screams echo through cold stone halls, shackles rattle in the dark, and crowds gather, not to help, but to watch. This isn't a nightmare. It was real. It was Bedlam. In the heart of medieval London stood the world's first institution for the mentally ill, Bedlam Royal Hospital. But what began as a religious refuge soon became a house of horror. For over 700 years, Bedlam was a place where pain was misunderstood, where mental illness was feared, mocked, and punished. Its name would come to define chaos itself, a living symbol of humanity's failure to care for its most vulnerable. This is not just the story of a hospital, it's the story of how a society treated the mind when it didn't understand the brain. A story of neglect, cruelty, spectacle, and survival. Welcome to Bedlam, where madness wasn't healed, it was put on display. Long before it became synonymous with madness, chaos, and suffering, Bedlam was born out of prayer. In 1247, under the reign of King Henry III, a humble priory was established in the Bishopsgate area of London. Its name, the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem. It was a charitable house, founded by a group of monks from the Order of the Star of Bethlehem. Their mission? To honor the Holy Land and offer care to the poor and sick in the name of the Virgin Mary. But even in its infancy, something was off. This hospital had no doctors, no organized medicine. The word psychiatry wouldn't even exist for another 600 years. It was less a place of treatment and more a warehouse for the unwanted, a sanctuary in name, but a prison in practice. As London's population grew and the streets swelled with poverty, plague, and paranoia, the Priory began accepting more and more people who didn't fit anywhere else. The blind, the mute, the disfigured, and soon those deemed mad. These were people who moaned in tongues, who wept for no reason, who wandered the streets talking to spirits or raved of visions no one else could see. In the 13th century, such behavior wasn't seen as illness. It was seen as sin, or worse, evidence of demonic possession. And so the Priory's halls began to fill with these possessed souls. They were kept apart from others, isolated in cold stone rooms with barred windows and heavy wooden doors. They were locked in darkness, fed scraps, and occasionally subjected to harsh prayers, chants, and forced exorcisms by clergy who believed they were casting out demons. By the late 14th century, this quiet shift had become official. The Priory had transformed into a place where madness was contained, not cured. It was one of the first institutions in Europe to house the mentally ill, but not to treat them. In 1403, a city ordinance finally referred to Bethlehem as a hospital for the insane, marking the birth of Bedlam as we know it. But this hospital had no healing hands, only shackles, only shadows, only silence. What began as a spiritual haven had become the world's first insane asylum, and its story would become a monument to mankind's failure to understand its own mind. By the early 15th century, Bedlam was no longer a secret. It was now a municipal institution under the control of the City of London, and as its name grew darker, so did its purpose. There were no treatments, no compassion, no understanding. The afflicted were restrained with manacles, locked in iron collars, and left in filthy straw-filled cells where the air reeked of urine, feces, sweat, and terror. They screamed into the night. Some cried to imaginary friends. Others stared silently at the walls, rocking in their own filth. One man was reported to sing church hymns for 23 hours straight. Another ripped his fingernails off trying to claw through the door. There was no classification system. No difference between someone with schizophrenia and someone suffering grief. Women grieving dead children were chained beside men who thought they were kings of the moon. But even more horrific than the treatment inside Bedlam was the entertainment outside it. By the late 1500s, Bedlam had become a public attraction. Citizens of London paid a penny, or sometimes brought wine and bread to the guards, to watch the lunatics perform. There were no laws against it. In fact, it was encouraged. The hospital's meager budget relied on these visitors. And the more outrageous the patients behaved, the more people paid. A wild woman who screamed in Latin drew crowds of wealthy noblemen. A man who claimed to be Jesus had regular visitors who mocked him mercilessly. The star attractions were given front-row cells so their torment could be best observed. Children were brought in to gawk. Lovers visited on dates. Local vendors sold hot meat pies and sweets outside the gates. Bedlam was a freak show wrapped in human misery, and yet behind the laughter of the crowd was something even darker, the belief that the mad were less than human. They were God's mistakes. They had no souls. To beat them was not cruelty. To cage them was not injustice. It was, in the eyes of the 16th century public, mercy. Those who spoke out, priests, writers, artists, were rare. But they existed. Some recorded the horrors of Bedlam in secret letters and drawings. But their voices were drowned out by the roar of laughter echoing down its corridors. By the dawn of the 1600s, Bedlam had become a living metaphor. The word itself now meant chaos, madness, disorder. And rightly so. Its halls were filled with the broken and the misunderstood. Its coffers were filled by the coins of the curious. And its walls, cold, cracked, and blood-stained, held the cries of thousands of forgotten souls. They were not patients, they were prisoners, and their agony was for sale. By the 17th century, Bedlam was no longer merely a place. It was a symbol of fear, of ridicule, and of everything society didn't want to face about the human mind. It was during this era that the word Bedlam entered the English language, not as a noun but as a warning. Don't let your house turn to Bedlam, people would say. It meant chaos, frenzy, a descent into madness, and it came to represent more than the institution. It represented the madness inside society itself. The notoriety of Bedlam spread far beyond London. Playwrights and poets seized upon it. William Shakespeare referenced it in King Lear, with the character of Edgar feigning madness and claiming to be a Bedlam beggar. The image of the wild-eyed, rag-wrapped lunatic roaming the countryside became a cultural archetype, a trope, a joke. But what wasn't a joke was the reality. Inside the stone walls of the institution, the horrors only deepened. Treatments were not only medieval, they were sadistic. Patients were subjected to rotational chairs, devices that spun victims violently with the belief it would shake the madness out. Cold water therapy, forcibly. Submerged in icy tubs until hypothermic. Bloodletting and blistering. Based on the ancient humoral theory, patients were cut or burned to rebalance supposed bodily fluids. Isolation cells, tiny stone chambers with no windows, and no sound, just darkness and time. Even doctors, if you could call them that, were caught in a fog of superstition. Many believed madness was the result of weak moral character, and the only way to fix it was through punishment, discipline, and pain. Despite this brutality, the institution doubled down on public exposure. The front wards were reserved for the most volatile patients, carefully placed for maximum spectacle. A clerk might enter the hospital to check on a cousin and leave laughing about the man who screamed about dragons in his stomach. Bedlam was a circus of suffering, where humiliation and torment became a form of civic amusement. Meanwhile, outside the hospital's gates, the legend of Bedlam grew. Poets and authors spun tales of madmen talking to angels. Broadsheets published rumors of Bedlam's inhuman conditions. Foreign visitors included the hospital on their tour of London sights, right alongside the Tower and the Globe Theatre. Merchants sold woodcut prints of inmates, as if they were celebrities of the underworld. The irony is that while society viewed the inmates as mad, it never questioned its own moral insanity in turning suffering into spectacle. By the end of the 1600s, Bedlam wasn't just a hospital. It was a brand of horror. And unlike a bad dream, it was real. Stone by stone, scream by scream. As Europe entered the Age of Enlightenment, the world began to question its darkest traditions. Science was replacing superstition, humanism was challenging cruelty, and yet, even in an era of supposed progress, Bedlam remained a relic of medieval horror. One of the key figures in this period was Dr. John Monroe, a physician from a prominent family dynasty that held control over Bedlam's medical practices for nearly a century. Monroe was respected, intelligent, and utterly trapped in outdated beliefs. He believed madness was the result of inflammation in the brain, but rather than investigate the mind, he prescribed violent physical treatments. Massive bloodletting. Burning herbs under patients' noses to purge vapors. Force-feeding concoctions of vinegar, mercury, and opium. Monroe's Bedlam was no better than a dungeon, even as the rest of Europe began exploring new methods. The idea of moral treatment, championed in France by Philippe Pinel, who famously unchained inmates at Bicêtre Hospital, was spreading. But in England, Bedlam lagged. In 1676, a grand new building had been constructed in Moorfields, designed to mirror the architecture of Versailles. It looked majestic from the outside, marble pillars, grand staircases, but the interior was still a theater of agony. Rats ran between the wards, rain seeped through the roof. Patients were kept on display like museum exhibits. Public access to the hospital continued. In fact, Bedlam received more visitors annually than St. Paul's Cathedral. It was said that up to 100,000 people a year came to gawk. By the 18th century, voices of dissent began to grow louder. William Hogarth, the artist, published his famous series, A Rake's Progress, with its final panel showing the protagonist chained in Bedlam, naked, mad, and surrounded by laughing visitors. Reformers and journalists began demanding oversight. Rumors spread of corruption, abuse, and cover-ups. Patients who recovered, or claimed to, sometimes published memoirs, revealing the filth, fear, and filicide inside the walls. One patient, James Tilly Matthews, was forcibly institutionalized for political beliefs and described an imaginary heirloom machine used to control thoughts. Today, his symptoms would likely be recognized as paranoid schizophrenia. Then they were treated with chains and humiliation. The early 1800s finally brought real reform. In 1815, Bedlam was moved again, this time to St. George's Fields in Southwark, a more modern facility. For the first time, chains were officially removed. Patients were given clean clothes. Exercise yards were introduced, but reform was slow and incomplete. Many staff still viewed patients as unruly animals. Treatments remained rooted in control, not compassion. The term moral treatment was adopted, but rarely practiced, and outside the walls, society still whispered the word Bedlam with a mix of fascination and fear. The institution had grown quieter, but its name echoed louder than ever. Behind the thick stone walls of Bedlam, thousands of lives unfolded in silence. Some screamed into the void, others waited, but nearly all of them were forgotten. These were not criminals, yet they were treated as such. There were no formal charges, no trials. If a family member claimed someone was mad, that was often enough. A husband could admit his wife. A son could commit his mother. A wealthy man could silence his rival by calling him unhinged. The mentally ill, the inconvenient, the misunderstood, all ended up behind Bedlam's locked doors. They weren't called patients, they were inmates, and their stories are haunting. Perhaps the most famous inmate in Bedlam's early history, Matthews was a tea broker turned political activist who was forcibly admitted in 1797. He believed he was being controlled by a machine called the heirloom, operated by a gang of evil scientists using invisible gases and magnetism to manipulate his thoughts. He spoke clearly, wrote eloquently, and remained lucid outside of his delusions, making his case complex. In today's terms, he would be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. In Bedlam, he was labeled insane and imprisoned for over a decade, despite multiple doctors saying he was harmless. Matthews spent years writing documents and drawing intricate diagrams of the machine he believed controlled him, some of which survive today. His mind was both brilliant and broken, and Bedlam neither healed nor understood him. In 1786, a frail woman approached King George III with a dessert knife and attempted to stab him. She was immediately arrested, but instead of being executed, she was declared criminally insane and sent to Bedlam. She had no history of violence. She never harmed the king. But she spent the next 42 years in the asylum, until her death. Throughout her confinement, she remained quiet, cooperative, and delusional, occasionally claiming royal blood herself. In an era before women had rights or mental health care, Margaret's story shows how quickly one moment of instability could lead to a life sentence in Bedlam. Most of Bedlam's victims left no journals, no names, no records. They were mothers, suffering postnatal depression, accused of hysteria, veterans with PTSD, labeled as raving mad, young girls who heard voices, burned and bled as witches, poor beggars with epilepsy, tied up and thrown into cells. Gay men accused of moral corruption, locked away for perversion, wives who defied their husbands, branded difficult and institutionalized. Some never left. Others were buried in mass graves beneath the hospital. Their stories lost, but their suffering echoed. In Bedlam, to be different was to be dangerous. To suffer was to be punished. To cry for help was to be silenced, and once inside there was no advocate, no trial, no escape. You were not a person. You were an exhibit. Perhaps the cruelest irony of Bedlam is that while its inmates screamed in pain, the public laughed and the hospital profited. Starting in the 17th century, Bedlam opened its gates to visitors. For a penny, anyone could enter and tour the wards. It became fashionable among the London elite to stroll through the halls of madness as if browsing an art gallery or attending a play. Wealthy families brought their children. Romantic couples visited on dates. Foreign dignitaries were led through on guided tours. One Italian visitor wrote in 1725, "The English take pleasure in everything, even the misery of their own people." The hospital encouraged it. The money was badly needed, and the more disturbing the display, the greater the tips. Guards and keepers would prompt patients to perform, scream, dance, curse, or strip. Those who refused were beaten. Those who obeyed became celebrities of cruelty. Patients like Tom O'Bedlam, a blind man who sang old ballads for coins, Mad Bess, who quoted scripture backwards and wore rags as a crown. The Howler, a man chained in a corner who screamed every hour on the hour. The more grotesque the behavior, the more the crowds laughed. Outside the hospital, vendors sold roasted chestnuts and toys. Bedlam had become a literal carnival of madness. Even the building's design reflected its perverse purpose. The most disturbed were placed in front-facing cells. The most visible halls were those with open bars, not doors. The smell of excrement and rot was ever present but rarely deterred visitors. In fact, it added to the thrill. There was no privacy, no dignity, and no empathy. And the profits? They rarely went to improve patient care. Instead, they lined the pockets of governors and city officials. Meanwhile, the inmates lay in rags, barefoot, half-fed, sleeping on straw soaked in filth. By the 1700s, Bedlam had the largest footfall of any tourist attraction in London. More than the churches, more than the theaters, more than the royal palaces. And all of it was built on the backs of people who couldn't speak for themselves. To the public, it was a novelty, a curiosity. To the inmates, it was hell. And to history, it is a shame that still stains the walls of modern mental health. By the dawn of the 19th century, the outcry over Bedlam had grown too loud to ignore. Newspapers, writers, and social critics condemned the institution's appalling treatment of the vulnerable. It was clear that change had to come, or at least the appearance of it. In 1815, Bedlam was moved once again, this time to a spacious, newly built complex in St. George's Fields, Southwark. The move was hailed as a new era for mental health care in England. The structure was larger, cleaner, and surrounded by open grounds and air. The public was told the bad old days of chains and beatings were over. But beneath the fresh paint, the philosophy hadn't changed. Patients were still treated as burdens. Many were admitted for reasons that today would be considered absurd, like anxiety, grief, or unmarried pregnancy. Some were admitted simply for being melancholic, idle, or rebellious. The rebranding didn't erase centuries of systemic cruelty. The asylum was no longer a prison, but it still wasn't a hospital. In the 1830s and 1840s, England began to embrace the moral treatment model, inspired by reformers like Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England. Moral treatment emphasized kindness, structured routines, manual labor, and peaceful environments. Patients were encouraged to walk, garden and write. Physical punishment was discouraged. Staff were told to speak calmly, to avoid cruelty. But this so-called humanity came with its own chains. Patients were expected to conform, to be useful, to show gratitude. Those who couldn't follow these ideals were once again deemed unfit, dangerous, or untreatable. Those who remained unruly or delusional were isolated. They were not healed, just kept out of sight. Even under moral treatment, freedom was still an illusion. Women who challenged doctors were diagnosed with hysteria. Men who mourned too long were called melancholic. Voices were still silenced, only now by gentler hands. By the late 1800s, the name Bedlam had become so stained that officials sought to erase it entirely. The institution was renamed simply as the Bedlam Royal Hospital. A title meant to invoke care and tradition, not fear. New administrators claimed this was a new chapter. There were medical officers, nurses, treatment plans. The hospital began collecting artwork from patients. It published reports. It even opened a training school for mental nurses. But the deeper truth lingered. The legacy of Bedlam could not be repainted. Even in the new buildings, patients complained of overcrowding, harsh discipline, and lack of dignity. Electroshock therapy and lobotomies would soon enter the psychiatric world, and again, the most vulnerable would suffer in the name of science. Bedlam had changed its skin, but the soul of the institution, the way it defined, treated, and exploited madness, was still far from compassionate. Today, Bedlam Royal Hospital still exists, now a part of the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. It is a modern, psychiatric facility offering therapies, community outreach, and support. The grounds are clean. The buildings are bright. The walls no longer echo with screaming. And yet, the ghost of Bedlam remains. The very word Bedlam is still used to describe chaos. Movies and TV shows still depict asylums with flickering lights and moaning patients. The image of the madman in the cell is still a trope in horror fiction and comedy alike. Most haunting of all, modern mental health systems continue to carry Bedlam's burden. Stigma. People still whisper the word mental like a curse. Underfunding. Psychiatric services often receive less support than physical health care. Neglect. Many patients still face homelessness, incarceration, or abandonment. Fear. Society still sees mental illness as dangerous before it sees it as human. But there is hope. Today's psychiatrists are trained to understand the complexity of the human brain. Treatments are based on science, not superstition. Mental health awareness campaigns are challenging centuries of silence. Survivors speak openly, reclaiming their stories once stolen by shame. There is a museum now, the Bedlam Museum of the Mind, where the history of the hospital is preserved, alongside the art and voices of former patients. The very people who were once displayed as monsters now have walls that honor their minds. And yet the question remains, how do we remember Bedlam? As a place, a warning, or a wound? Because in truth, Bedlam is not just history. It is a reflection of fear, of power, of what happens when we stop seeing people and start labeling them. If we are not careful, Bedlam can happen again, not in stone corridors, but in crowded ERs, jail cells, and silent homes. Its walls may be gone, but its lesson is still unfinished. Bedlam was never just a building. It was a mirror held up to society's darkest instincts. It showed how quickly fear can replace compassion, how easily pain can become entertainment, and how the voiceless can be caged when no one is willing to listen. Today, its stones have crumbled, and its name has softened, but the shadow of Bedlam still lingers. In every stigma, every ignored cry for help, every system that punishes illness instead of healing it. To understand Bedlam is to confront not just the past, but our present. Because the real horror isn't that it existed. It's that for centuries no one questioned it. And now the question is ours. Will we learn from it or repeat it? In the heart of London stood a place that would come to symbolize the darkest depths of mental health treatment in history. Bedlam Royal Hospital, better known as Bedlam. Established in the 13th century, it became infamous not for healing, but for horror. Patients were chained, mocked, and even put on display for paying spectators. This is the chilling story of history's first insane asylum, where madness met cruelty.